There's a unique kind of silence that can fall over you in a room full of your own family. It's the silence of being looked through, not at for years. I had mistaken it for peace. At my Thanksgiving table this year, the very table I've polished and set for 45 holiday seasons, that silence finally became a roar. It wasn't a loud argument that broke me, then, but a small, elegant card placed beside my plate by my daughter in law. It was a list of chores disguised as a family announcement, a message that made me realize my role was to maintain the stage, not be part of the play. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Eleanor, though everyone who has truly known me has always called me Ellie. At 70 years old, you begin to measure your life not just in years, but in the layers of memories that settle over you like fine dust on old furniture. Each particle a story waiting to be told. For me, most of that dust has settled here, in this house perched on the rocky coast of Maine. It has been my home for 45 years, a steadfast witness to the tides of my life, its cedar shingles weathered to a soft silver by the relentless salt spray. The house is more than just wood and nails. It is a living archive of my existence, a vessel holding the echoes of laughter, the balm of tears, and the quiet dignity of a life lived fully within its walls. The floorboards whisper stories of my late husband, Arthur, carrying me across the threshold as a young bride, his eyes bright with a future that felt as boundless as the Atlantic stretching before us. They remember the weight of his toolbox when he spent a whole autumn building the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in the living room, insisting that a home without books had no soul. I can still trace the grain of the wood he chose, and remember the scent of sawdust mingling with the sea air. Those shelves now hold a lifetime of reading, from my worn copies of Jane Austen to Arthur's collection of maritime histories. Each book is a friend, each shelf a monument to the man I loved. The house remembers our son, Liam's first stumbling steps toward the grand bay window that overlooks the sea, his tiny hands pressed against the cool glass as he watched the lobster boats chug out of the harbor at dawn. It is a house built not just with timber, but with intention and love. This house has always been my sanctuary, but its familiar but peaceful atmosphere began to shift 12 years ago. The change arrived with my daughter-in-law, Chloe. When Liam first brought her home, Kamal, I saw a sophisticated, confident young woman. And in my desire for my son's happiness, I welcomed her with open arms. I was eager to share the family traditions I held so dear, hoping to weave her into the fabric of our lives. I did not realize then that Chloe viewed that fabric not as a tapestry to be cherished, but as an old carpet to be ripped out and replaced with something sleek, modern, and utterly devoid of history. Her version of family was less about shared heritage and more about curated appearances. The changes started subtly, small suggestions delivered with a smile so bright it was meant to disarm. "Ellie, darling," she'd murmur, running a perfectly manicured finger over the worn oak of my dining table. "Have you considered something a bit more streamlined? The rustic look is charming, of course, but a bit heavy for modern entertaining." The table's scratches were a map of our family's history, but to Chloe, they were merely blemishes. Soon, her suggestions became more insistent. I remember the weekend she unilaterally decided the kitchen needed an upgrade. She had a high-end, stainless steel espresso machine delivered, a monstrous, complicated device that sat on my simple butcher block counter like a spaceship landed in a farmer's field. "Every modern home needs good coffee," she had declared sapines, ignoring the fact that I had been perfectly happy with my simple percolator for decades. Her influence grew, gently but relentlessly eroding my place and my taste. My son, Liam, became a master of strategic retreat. He, who had once climbed the tallest oak tree in the yard on a dare, now shied away from the smallest confrontation with his wife. I recall an evening when Chloe criticized the way I was reading a bedtime story to Sophie, suggesting a different, more developmentally appropriate tone. When I looked at Liam for support, he just shrugged, offering a weak smile. "She's just trying to help. Mom, she reads a lot about modern parenting." His desperate quest for domestic peace slowly erased my voice, leaving me feeling like a curator in a museum dedicated to someone else's life. A ghost polishing the heirlooms of a past I was no longer truly part of. This past Thanksgiving, the familiar rituals felt more vital than ever, a deliberate act of remembrance on my part. I rose before dawn, the kitchen dark and silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant moan of a foghorn out at sea. I moved through the familiar dance of preparation, my hands knowing each step by heart. I prepared the turkey with the same blend of sage, thyme, and rosemary my mother had taught me, its savory aroma a fragrant shield against the tensions I knew the day would bring. The pie crust was my grandmother's recipe, flaky and rich with cold butter. Each dish was a connection, a thread tying me to the women who came before me. I was clinging to these traditions as if they could anchor me, a reminder of a time when my role in this family was clear and cherished. The family arrived in waves of what felt like manufactured cheer. Liam, Chloe, and the children, 11-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Leo, came first. The children were a balm to my soul, running to me with hugs that felt like the only truly solid thing in my world. "Grandma Ellie, it smells so good," Leo exclaimed, burying his face in my apron. I held him tight, breathing in the scent of childhood, a mixture of cold autumn air and sweet soap. Sophie, ever more observant, looked at me with a knowing sympathy in her young eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the household's delicate politics. Chloe, however, glided in, offering a perfunctory air kiss near my cheek that smelled of expensive perfume and faint disapproval. Dressed in a cream-colored cashmere sweater that seemed immune to the very concept of a kitchen stain, she began her silent audit of my work. A barely perceptible smudge on a window pane earned a subtle frown. A cushion on the sofa, slightly askew, was immediately corrected with a sharp pat. Liam followed, offering me a strained smile before busying himself with the children, effectively leaving me to face Chloe's meticulous inspection alone. Her parents arrived soon after, pleasant but distant, their conversation revolving around golf clubs and stock portfolios, a world away from my own. An hour later, we gathered around the dining table. It was laden with the feast I had spent 2 days preparing: the golden brown turkey, the cranberry sauce gleaming like jewels in my mother's crystal bowl, the steaming piles of mashed potatoes and green bean casserole. Liam sat at the head, looking handsome but tired. Chloe sat to his right, a radiant hostess in a home that was not hers. I took my customary seat closest to the kitchen, the position that had become mine by default, ensuring I could leap up for a forgotten condiment or a fresh platter. Before Liam could say grace, Chloe cleared her throat, a small, theatrical sound. "Before we eat," she began, her voice imbued with a practiced excitement, "Liam and I have a little surprise for everyone." She beamed at the children, whose eyes widened. My own heart gave a hopeful flutter. "We've been planning something very special," she continued, her gaze sweeping the table. "We're taking a family trip, 10 days of skiing in Aspen, Colorado. We leave tomorrow morning." A chorus of cheers erupted from the children. "And, of course," Chloe added, her smile never wavering, "we're bringing Sarah, the nanny, along so that Liam and I can have some proper couples time. It will be one big happy family." Her gaze then swept past the joyful faces of her children and landed, pointedly, on me. "And Ellie, we didn't forget about you," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a single, small, cream-colored card. With a slow, deliberate movement that drew all eyes, she slid it across the polished surface of the table. It stopped just inches from my plate. The chatter died, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. My hand trembled as I picked it up. It was made of thick, expensive cardstock, its weight feeling obscene in my grasp. Printed in an elegant, looping script were the words that would stop my heart. "House sitting duties?" The heading read. Below it, a bulleted list: deep clean all rooms, organize closets, tend to plants, expected completion by December 5th. And at the very bottom, a line that felt like a physical blow, a final, the crushing dismissal. Thank you for your service. Service. The words swam before my eyes, the ink blurring against the creamy background. It was the word for hired help, for staff, for someone peripheral. A hot flush crept up my neck, my own blood a traitor rising in shame. I could feel the metallic taste of humiliation on my tongue, sharp and bitter. The aroma of the turkey I had so lovingly prepared suddenly seemed sickening. I risked a glance around the table. Chloe's parents were suddenly fascinated by their napkins. Sarah, the nanny, looked at me with wide, horrified eyes before quickly looking down at her lap. My grandchildren were looking at me, their faces etched with a confusion that mirrored my own internal chaos. And Liam, I looked at my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose heartbreaks I had mended. He was now studying the intricate pattern of his fork as if it held the secrets to the universe. He would not meet my eyes. His silence was absolute. Not a single word was offered in my defense. And in that void, he gave his consent. It was an abdication so complete, so profound, that it felt more violent than any shouted insult. I felt something inside me, a structure of tolerance built over 12 long years of swallowing my pride, begin to crumble into dust. Yet I would not give them the satisfaction of watching it fall. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air catching in my tight chest. I forced my lips into the shape of a smile, and I met Chloe's triumphant, glittering gaze. Of course, I managed to say, my voice a stranger to my own ears, thin and brittle but steady. I'll take good care of everything. The forced smile remained plastered on my face long after the front door clicked shut, a brittle mask that took an immense effort to maintain. I stood motionless in the hallway, listening to the sound of their SUV pulling out of the driveway, its engine fading into the damp November night. Only when the house was enveloped in a profound, ringing silence did the mask crumble, and with it, the last vestiges of my composure. I leaned against the wall, the cool plaster a stark contrast to the heat of shame that still burned on my cheeks, the lingering aroma of roast turkey and apple pie, which hours ago had been a source of pride, now seemed thick and cloying, the scent of my own elaborate humiliation. The rest of that evening passed in a blur of mechanical motions. I cleared the debris of the feast, scraping plates filled with food I couldn't remember anyone eating, my hands moving with a robotic efficiency that belied the storm raging inside me. Every dish I washed, every glass I polished, felt like an act of erasing my own worth. I was performing the very duties that had been assigned to me, a servant tidying up after the masters had retired. The elegantly scripted card lay on the kitchen counter, its cream-colored surface catching the light, mocking me. Thank you for your service. The words were a brand, searing themselves into my consciousness. I had served this family with the whole of my being for decades, and my reward was to be relegated to the role of an unpaid, unacknowledged housekeeper. Sleep was an impossibility. The house, my sanctuary, felt alien and vast. Every creak of the old floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows, sounded like an accusation. I wandered through the darkened rooms, a ghost in my own home, haunted by the memory of Liam's averted gaze. It was his silence, more than Chloe's cruelty, that had truly broken something inside me. It was the quiet confirmation that in the calculus of his life, my dignity was a small and acceptable price to pay for his domestic peace. I finally retreated to my own bedroom, but the sense of violation followed me. This room, which had remained my personal haven, now felt like the designated staff quarters in a home I no longer recognized as my own. The next morning, a pale, watery light filtered through the windows, illuminating a world drained of color. I woke with a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach, a cold, hard knot of anger that had solidified overnight. The list, Chloe's list, I found it on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, a silent, imperious demand. Deep clean all rooms, organize closets. It was a declaration of her ownership, not just of the space, but of me. A strange, defiant impulse took hold. If I was to be the help, then I would perform my duties. I would enter every room, open every closet, and see the life they had built within the walls of my home. I started with the guest rooms, which were, as always, immaculately tidy, rarely used. Then, I moved to the children's rooms, a pang of love and sorrow hitting me as I saw Sophie's carefully arranged books and Leo's Lego creations. They were innocent in all of this, pawns in their mother's quiet war. Finally, I stood before the master bedroom, their inner sanctum. The room had been redecorated by Chloe last year in shades of gray and silver, cool and impersonal as a high-end hotel suite. She had disposed of the sturdy oak furniture Arthur and I had shared, replacing it with sleek, low-profile pieces that seemed to have no history. My instructions were to organize closets, and so I began. Chloe's walk-in closet was a boutique of designer labels, shoes arranged by color, handbags displayed on custom shelving like museum artifacts. It was the closet of a woman who spent money with an ease that now seemed suspicious. Liam's side was more modest, but it was on his cluttered desk in the corner of the room that my journey took a fateful turn. It was piled high with papers, business invoices, catalogs, old magazines. It was a mess, and my duties included tidying. As I lifted a heavy stack of financial journals to dust beneath them, my hand faltered, and a thick accordion file slipped from the bottom of the pile, spilling its contents onto the floor. I knelt to gather the scattered papers, my movements slow and resentful. Most were innocuous car insurance statements, old tax receipts, business correspondence, but one envelope, thicker than the rest, caught my eye. It was from a major national bank I didn't recognize, and it was addressed to both Liam and Chloe. It had been opened carelessly. My heart began to beat a little faster. I knew I shouldn't look. It was a violation of their privacy. But the words on that Thanksgiving card echoed in my mind. They had already violated me in the most profound way. My hands, trembling slightly, pulled out the folded statement within. The heading read, Home Equity Line of Credit Statement. I scanned the details, my blood turning to ice. The account had been opened 3 years ago. The property listed as collateral was this one, my address, my home. And at the bottom of the page, a number that made me gasp for air, an outstanding balance of nearly $100,000. It was impossible. This house was mine, free and clear. Arthur's life insurance had paid off the last of the mortgage 15 years ago, a fact I knew as surely as I knew my own name. I had never signed any papers for a loan. I had never been to this bank. The realization washed over me in a sickening wave of numb disbelief. My signature must have been forged. Chloe, with her sophisticated understanding of finances and her relentless desire for a life beyond their means, must have convinced Liam to open this line of credit against the value of my home. And Liam, my trusting, conflict-averse son, had likely gone along with it, believing her justifications about needing funds for renovations or as a business contingency. But there had been no major renovations. Only Chloe's endless acquisitions of expensive furniture, clothes, and trips. This wasn't a loan for the family. It was her personal slush fund, secured by the one thing I held most dear. I sank into the cold leather of Chloe's vanity chair, the statement clutched in my hand. The woman hadn't just been erasing my presence, she had been mortgaging my past and stealing my future. For hours, I sat there in that sterile room, the world narrowing to the damning numbers on that piece of paper. The anger I felt was a cold, pure, clarifying fire. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound, but it was now overlaid with a sense of profound, chilling betrayal that demanded action. But what action? I felt small and utterly alone. A 70-year-old woman against a cunning, manipulative daughter-in-law and the son who enabled her. I needed an ally. I needed someone who was outside this toxic bubble, someone whose loyalty was unquestionable. My mind flew across the country, 3,000 miles away to California, to my other son, to Michael. Michael, my eldest, was his father's son through and through, practical, steady, with a strong moral compass and no patience for deceit. He had always been wary of Chloe's polished exterior, though he was too polite to say so directly during his infrequent visits. As I walked to the kitchen and picked up the phone, my hand was steady. My internal debate was over. The habit of a lifetime of not making a fuss, of bearing my burdens in silence, was broken. I was no longer just a mother feeling hurt. I was a property owner who had been the victim of a crime. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Mom, everything okay? It's late out there. I took a deep breath. Michael, I need to talk to you. Something has happened. I started at the beginning, my voice trembling at first as I described the Thanksgiving dinner. The casual cruelty of the announcement, the humiliating card. I could hear the sharp intake of his breath over the line. She did what? He asked, his voice low and tight with disbelief. I continued, explaining my long, sleepless night and my discovery that morning. As I detailed the HELOC statement, the line went quiet. For a moment, I feared he wouldn't believe me, that the story was too outlandish. Mom, he said finally, and the warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by a cold, hard fury I hadn't heard since he was a teenager who'd caught a neighborhood bully picking on Liam. Are you holding the statement right now? Yes, I whispered. Read me the bank's name and the account number. I did. I could hear the sound of furious typing in the background. Okay, he said after a moment. Okay, Mom, you did nothing wrong. You were robbed. This is grand larceny. This is forgery. Hearing him put legal terms to it crystallized everything. It wasn't just a family squabble, it was a crime. I can't believe Liam would let this happen. Michael continued, his anger now clearly directed at his brother. How could he be so blind? He just wanted to keep the peace. Michael, you know how he is with Chloe, I said, a weak, reflexive defense of my younger son. Peace? Michael shot back, his voice incredulous. Mom, that's not peace. That's surrender. He surrendered you. He surrendered Dad's legacy. The words were harsh, but they were true. A wave of guilt washed over me, the guilt of a mother who sees the flaws in her child. What do I do? Michael, I asked, my voice small. His response was immediate and absolute. First thing tomorrow morning, you are calling Mr. Davies. You're not going to talk to Liam or Chloe. You're not going to send a single text message. You are going to talk to our lawyer. You are the sole owner of that house, and you are going to secure it. This ends now. His unwavering support was a lifeline. It was the external validation I desperately needed, the permission to fight back that I hadn't been able to give myself. The fear and confusion that had swirled around me for the past 24 hours began to recede, replaced by a firm, cold resolve. We talked for another half hour, his mind clear and strategic, outlining a plan of action. By the time we hung up, the sun was beginning to set, painting the kitchen in hues of orange and gold. I stood by the window, looking out at the familiar, beloved view of the sea. But I was seeing it with new eyes. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like my fortress. And I was no longer its servant. I was its defender. The long night of my sorrow was over. Tomorrow, the fight would begin. The first light of dawn had not yet broken through the thick Maine fog when my eyes opened the next morning. There was no grogginess, no lingering haze of sleep. Instead, my mind was sharp, possessed by a clarity that was as cold and bracing as the sea air outside my window. The despair of the previous night had been burned away by the fire of Michael's anger and the solid ground of his support. I was no longer a victim adrift in a sea of confusion. I was a woman with a mission. And my first port of call was the law. I waited until precisely 9 o'clock, the time I knew Mr. Davies' office would officially open, Mr. R. Davies had been our family lawyer for 30 years. He had handled the sale of my parents' home, drafted Arthur's will with a gentle competence that had soothed my grieving heart, and had even reviewed the incorporation papers for Liam's first business venture. He was a man of integrity and quiet wisdom. My hand was steady as I dialed the familiar number, my resolve having settled deep into my bones. His longtime secretary, Mrs. Gable, recognized my voice immediately. "Eleanor, how lovely to hear from you. Is everything all right?" Her tone held the familiar warmth of small-town courtesy. And for a moment, I was tempted to say that everything was fine. But the time for polite fictions was over. "I need to speak with Mr. Davies on an urgent matter." "Doris, it's of a legal and sensitive nature." The change in my own tone must have been palpable, because her warmth was immediately replaced by professional efficiency. A moment later, Mr. Davies's calm, baritone voice came through the line. "Ellie, my dear, what can I do for you?" I took a deep breath and began to tell my story. I omitted the emotional nuances of the family dinner, focusing instead on the concrete facts: my sole ownership of the property, the discovery of the home equity line of credit, and the account number of the statement I now held in my hand. I could hear the silence stretching on his end of the line, punctuated only by the faint, rhythmic scratching of a pen on a legal pad. It was the sound of a professional mind at work, piecing together the ugly puzzle I had laid before him. "Eleanor," he said finally, and his voice had lost all of its folksy warmth, replaced now by a sharp legal gravity. "First, let me be unequivocally clear. The deed to your property is solely in your name. Arthur made sure of that. Without your notarized signature, no legitimate financial institution should have been able to place a lien of that nature against your home." He paused. "What you are describing sounds very much like a case of identity theft and bank fraud. It is a serious felony." Hearing him confirm Michael's assessment sent a chill through me, but it was a validating chill. I was not overreacting. I was not a hysterical old woman. I was a victim of a serious crime. "What do you advise, Henry?" I asked, my voice low. His instructions were immediate and precise. "The first thing you must do is secure the property. You have every legal right to control who has access to your home. I want you to call a locksmith today and have every single exterior lock changed. Do not inform Liam or Chloe of this. Second, I will begin a formal inquiry with the bank in question to ascertain the legitimacy of the loan documents. I suspect we will find a forged signature. Third, I will draft a formal notice of eviction to be served to Liam and Chloe upon their return, terminating their residency at your property." Each instruction was a stone being laid, forming a path out of the wilderness of my despair. This was no longer just an emotional battle, it was a legal one, and with rules and strategies. After I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. I walked to the old roll-top desk in the living room and pulled out the local phone book, its pages thin and worn. I looked up locksmiths, and my finger traced down the list until it found a name I recognized: Miller and Sons, Est, 1978. Old Pete Miller had been in business almost as long as I had lived in this house. I called him, and in a calm, steady voice, I requested a complete replacement of all my locks for that afternoon. With the first legal and practical steps in motion, a new, more audacious idea began to form in my mind. It wasn't enough to secure the house. I had to reclaim it. I looked around the living room, at the enormous, sterile gray sofa that Chloe had insisted upon, at the glass and chrome coffee table that was perpetually covered in fingerprints, at the abstract art on the walls, splashes of angry color that meant nothing to me. These objects were not just furniture, they were symbols of my slow erasure, physical manifestations of Chloe's conquest. They had to go. The following morning, after the new solid brass locks and deadbolts had been installed, I took out my camera. I moved through my house with the methodical precision of a forensic investigator, documenting everything. I photographed every room from every angle, capturing the cold, impersonal aesthetic Chloe had imposed. The photos were my evidence, a record of the life that had been forced upon me, a before to the after I was about to create. With the camera full of images, I drove into the larger town of Kennebunkport, heading for a high-end consignment shop I had heard about, a place called the Curator's Collection. The shop was run by a woman my age named Martha, whose sharp eyes and elegant silver hair told me she was a woman who didn't suffer fools. I introduced myself and explained that I had a significant amount of nearly new, high-end furniture I wished to sell. Her professional interest was piqued. I showed her the photos on my camera's small screen. She whistled low as she clicked through the images of the living room set, the formal dining suite, the pristine guest bedroom furniture. This is very fine merchandise. Eleanor, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. But it all looks brand new. It's unusual for someone to get rid of an entire house of furniture like this. Are you moving? Here was the hurdle, the moment of potential doubt. I could see the question in her eyes. Did I truly have the right to sell these things? I met her gaze without flinching. No, Martha, I'm not moving, I said, my voice calm and even. I am redecorating. After many years of living with a style that was not my own, I have decided it is time to reclaim my house and fill it with things that bring me joy. For added measure, I pulled a folded copy of my property deed from my purse. I am the sole owner of the property where this furniture resides. A slow smile spread across Martha's face. She was a shrewd businesswoman, but she was also a woman who had lived long enough to read between the lines. She nodded, a gesture of understanding and respect. Well then, you've come to the right place. For pieces like this, I can have my boys out to your house for pickup tomorrow morning. We spent the next hour negotiating prices and terms. I left her shop not only with a signed contract, but with a renewed sense of my own competence. I had faced a challenge, stated my case calmly and truthfully, and I had prevailed. The following week was a whirlwind of transformation. Martha's moving truck arrived as promised, and her strong, careful movers emptied the rooms of Chloe's cold perfection. For a day, the house echoed with emptiness. But it was a clean, hopeful emptiness, a blank canvas awaiting my touch. That week, I began my own acquisitions. I did not go to a large furniture showroom. Instead, I visited the small, independent shops scattered along the coast in a dusty antique store in Ogunquit. I found a beautiful, high-backed reading chair with worn floral upholstery that seemed to welcome me home. In a local craftsman's workshop, I commissioned a dining table to be made from reclaimed pine, its surface already scarred with the history of a previous life. I bought a comfortable those deep blue sectional sofa you could curl up on with a book and a cup of tea without worrying about wrinkles. I chose sturdy, simple bedroom furniture made of warm cherry wood. Nothing was chosen to impress. Everything was chosen for comfort, for warmth, for me. As the new pieces began to arrive, then I spent hours arranging everything, placing my new reading chair by the bay window where the morning light was best, and setting the kitchen table so I could watch the chickadees at the bird feeder while I ate my breakfast. But the most satisfying moment, the act that truly felt like the final reclamation of my soul, came when I climbed the pull-down stairs to the attic. There, in a large, sealed trunk, were the family photographs Chloe had deemed too personal or cluttered for the common areas. I carefully unwrapped each one. There was Arthur and me on our wedding day, young and impossibly hopeful. There was a faded picture of Liam as a toddler, sitting proudly on his father's shoulders. There was a photo of my own parents, long since passed, standing on the very porch of this house. One by one, I brought them downstairs. I polished the frames, cleaned the glass, and hung them back in their rightful places on the walls of my living room, my hallway, my kitchen. Each nail I tapped into the wall was an act of defiance, an affirmation of my history. With every photo I hung, the ghosts of my past returned not as specters of sorrow, but as a loving, supportive presence. The house was no longer just a fortress, it was finally, truly my home again. The 10 days that followed were unlike any I had experienced in the last 12 years. They were quiet, but it was a restorative quiet, not the tense, oppressive silence of before. The house seemed to breathe alongside me, its old timbers settling into a comfortable rhythm. I spent the days acquainting myself with my new surroundings, my own choices. I read for hours in the welcoming embrace of my floral armchair, the sunlight streaming through the clean bay window, no longer feeling a nagging guilt that I should be doing something more productive. I cooked simple meals for myself, reveling in the freedom of not having to cater to anyone else's palate. It was the scent of my own life. I spoke with Michael every evening. His calls were a source of strength, a reaffirmation that my actions were not born of spite, but of a long overdue self preservation. He had spoken with Mr. Davies as well, and they were working in tandem, Michael providing the emotional support while our lawyer handled the strategic fortifications. Mr. Davies had sent me copies of the letters he had dispatched to the bank, formal inquiries that were the first salvos in a war I had never intended to fight, but one I was now determined to win. I was not just waiting, I was preparing. Each day, I felt a layer of the weariness I had carried for years begin to slough off, replaced by a calm, steady resolve. I was the guardian of my home, standing watch. On the 10th day, a Sunday, I knew they would be returning. A storm had rolled in off the Atlantic overnight, and a cold, driving rain lashed against the windows. The gray sky mirrored the solemnity of the occasion. I sat at my new reclaimed pine table in the kitchen, a steaming mug of tea warming my hands, and watched the road. There was no anxiety in my chest. There was only a profound sense of stillness, the calm at the center of a hurricane. I had spent the morning baking a simple apple cake, not for them, but for me. The comforting scent of cinnamon filled the air, a final act of domestic reclamation before the confrontation. At precisely 4:17 p.m., the familiar silver SUV pulled into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as the doors opened and my family spilled out, looking weary and rumpled from their long journey. Liam's shoulders were slumped with fatigue. Chloe was already directing the unloading of luggage with sharp, impatient gestures. Sophie and Leo looked tired and irritable. Sarah, the nanny, moved quickly, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Though I sensed in her movements a desperate wish to be anywhere else. For a moment, watching them, they looked like strangers arriving at the wrong house. In a way, they were. I remained seated as I heard their footsteps on the porch, followed by the sound of a key in the new brass lock. I heard the scrape of metal, then a click that failed to turn. A pause. The key was withdrawn and inserted again, more forcefully, more rattling. That's strange. I heard Liam mutter, his voice muffled by the thick oak door. The key's not working. Chloe's voice, sharp with irritation, cut through the sound of the rain. What do you mean, it's not working? You're probably using the wrong one. Give it to me. More jingling, more forceful rattling. The silence that followed was charged with a growing frustration. None of them work, Liam said, his voice now holding a note of bewilderment. It's like the lock has been changed. That's ridiculous, Chloe snapped. Who would change our locks then? I heard their footsteps moving toward the kitchen door. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. Its warmth a small, steady anchor. The handle on the kitchen door turned, rattled, and stopped. It, too, was locked. A sharp knock sounded on the glass panel. Mom, Liam called out, his face appearing in the rain-streaked window. Mom, are you in there? We can't get in. I placed my teacup gently in its saucer, rose from my chair, and walked to the door. Through the glass, I could see them all huddled on the small porch, looking cold, wet, and confused. I drew back the deadbolt, a solid, satisfying clunk of metal, and opened the door just a few inches, not enough to welcome them in. The cold, damp air rushed into my warm kitchen. Hello, I said, my voice pleasant and calm. How was your trip? Liam looked immensely relieved. Mom, thank God. Something's wrong with the locks. None of our keys seem to fit. He took a step forward, but stopped mid-stride, his eyes looking past me into the house. His face slackened with utter confusion. What? What happened in here? Chloe pushed past him, her face a thundercloud. What is going on? Why are we standing out in the... Her words died in her throat as her gaze fell upon the living room. She saw the warm, deep blue sofa where her sterile gray monolith used to be. She saw the welcoming armchair where her sleek chaise had sat. She saw the walls, now adorned with the warm, smiling faces of my family's history instead of her cold, abstract prints. Her face went white with shock, then contorted into a mask of pure rage. What have you done? She shrieked. Where is my furniture? I met her furious gaze without flinching. My own voice, when it came, was simple, quiet, and devastatingly clear. I sold it, I said. It didn't suit me. The silence that followed was more explosive than her shriek. Chloe's disbelief morphed into a sputtering, incoherent rage. You sold it. You can't do that. That was my furniture. It was worth a fortune. This is my house. She lunged toward the doorway as if to push past me, but I did not move. No, Chloe, I said, my voice retaining its unnerving calm. That's where you are mistaken. This has always been my house. Her accusations began to pour out, a torrent of venom. She called me a thief, a vindictive old woman. She accused me of being senile. She threatened to call the police. Liam, looking utterly lost between us, finally found his voice. Mom, Chloe, please. He pleaded. Let's just all come inside and talk about this calmly. There has to be an explanation. There is an explanation. Liam, I said, my gaze shifting back to his wife, who was now panting with fury. But the furniture was the least of my concerns. I was more troubled by the $100,000 line of credit you opened against my house 3 years ago. The words landed in the charged atmosphere like a lit match on gasoline. Every trace of color drained from Chloe's face. Liam turned to her, his own face a mask of complete bewilderment. A line of credit. What is she talking about, Chloe? Chloe began to stammer, her eyes darting around wildly. She's lying. It was for investments, for our future. You knew about it, she insisted, grabbing Liam's arm. I knew we discussed a contingency fund, Liam said slowly. I never knew you actually did it. And I certainly didn't know you would do it against my mother's house. I was protecting our family, Chloe cried, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. She doesn't need all this equity. She's old. We have children. We have needs. Liam, I said quietly, cutting through her frantic denials. I held up a single sheet of paper I'd retrieved from the kitchen counter, a copy of the bank statement Mr. Davies had acquired for me. Perhaps this will clarify things. I held it out to him. He took it with a trembling hand. He read the document, and I watched the precise moment the truth settled upon him. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, the foundation of his trust, the entire structure of the life he thought he had, crumbled to dust. He looked up from the paper, not at me, but at his wife. And the look in his eyes was one of such utter devastation, it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. You forged her signature, he whispered. It was necessary, Chloe sobbed. For us. But Liam was no longer listening, that he was looking at me, at his mother, standing calmly in the doorway of the home he had allowed to become a battleground. He was seeing the 12 years of slights, of humiliations, of my slow, steady erasure, all culminating in this single, monstrous act of betrayal. He understood. He finally understood the full cost of his peace. Chloe, seeing that she had lost him, that her frantic web of lies had finally unraveled, let out a choked gasp. It was a final, theatrical surrender to a reality she could not manipulate. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and her body, suddenly devoid of all its rigid, controlling energy, crumpled forward. She fainted, slumping onto the wet porch floor in a heap of expensive, rain-dampened cashmere. The children burst into tears. Sarah, the nanny, gasped and rushed to Chloe's side. And Liam just stood there, staring down at the unconscious form of his wife, the damning piece of paper still clutched in his hand, looking like a man who had just lost everything. The chaos that followed Chloe's collapse was a blur of flashing lights and muted, professional voices. Liam, galvanized into action by the sheer gravity of the situation, had called for an ambulance. I remained in the doorway, a silent observer, as the paramedics efficiently tended to his unconscious wife. They spoke in low tones of stress and exhaustion. I did not correct them. When they loaded her onto the gurney, she was conscious again. Her accusations against me now interspersed with desperate pleas for Liam to fight for their home. He looked at her then, his face a gray, unreadable mask, and said quietly, "It was never our home. Chloe." That was the moment I stepped back and closed my door, leaving him to manage the wreckage he had helped create. The 3 days that followed were quiet, but of a different sort than the peaceful solitude I had enjoyed before. It was a heavy, waiting silence, thick with unspoken questions and the impending weight of difficult conversations. My new furniture, Weichsel, which had seemed so full of promise, now felt like stage dressing for a play whose final act was yet to be written. I moved through my reclaimed home, my fortress, but felt little of the triumph I had anticipated. There was only a deep, hollow ache. I had won back my house, but in doing so, the fault lines that had run beneath my family for years had finally fractured. And I did not know what, if anything, could be rebuilt upon the ruins. Mr. Davies called twice, his voice a calm, steady presence amidst the turmoil. He informed me that the bank had begun its internal fraud investigation and that he had formally sent the notice of eviction to a temporary address Liam had provided. Michael called every morning and every evening from California, his voice a potent mixture of rage on my behalf and deep disappointment in his brother. "Don't let him guilt you, Mom," he warned. "Don't let him use the kids to make you feel sorry for him. He made his bed." I knew he was right, but the cold logic of justice felt different from the messy, tangled reality of a mother's heart. I was angry with Liam, a deep, foundational anger, but I also mourned for the man he had failed to become. On the third evening, just as a deep, purple twilight was settling over the sea, I saw the headlights of a rental car pull into my driveway. It was a small, unassuming sedan, a world away from the luxury SUV he usually drove. A single figure emerged. It was Liam, and he was alone. I watched from the living room window as he walked slowly up the stone path. His shoulders slumped, not just with fatigue, but with the crushing weight of his new reality. He looked smaller, diminished by it all. He did not try his old key but knocked softly on the door. A hesitant, respectful rap that was an acknowledgement of my new sovereignty. I opened the door and let him in without a word. He stood awkwardly in the entryway, his eyes taking in the room, truly seeing it for the first time. He looked at the photographs of his childhood on the wall, at the comfortable blue sofa, at the warm lamplight falling on the worn pages of a book on my reading chair. "It looks nice." "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, "it looks like it used to." I gestured toward the sofa, and he sank into its cushions, looking as though his legs could no longer support him. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, a small, steadying anchor in the ocean of things unsaid between us. When I handed him the mug, our fingers brushed, and I was struck by how cold his hands were. He stared into the dark liquid for a long time before he finally looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a pain so profound it was difficult to witness. "Mom," he began, his voice cracking on the single word, "Ashto, I am so sorry." It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of 12 years of neglect, of 1,000 small betrayals. He did not wait for me to respond, but pressed on, the words tumbling out as if a dam had finally broken. I'm not just sorry for the money or the house, he said, shaking his head. I'm sorry for all of it. For every time I let her criticize your cooking. For every holiday I let her sideline you. For every time I saw that look of hurt in your eyes and chose to look away because it was easier than facing her anger. He set the coffee cup down on the table, his hands trembling too much to hold it. I was a coward. I was so afraid of her moods, of her tears, of the fights that would last for days. She would tell me I was choosing my mother over my wife, that I was letting you control our lives. She was so confident, so sure, that after a while, I started to believe her. That was the admission that pierced through my anger, the confession that laid his failure bare. It wasn't just weakness, it was a slow, creeping poison that had allowed him to reframe his wife's cruelty as my failing. I let her convince me that your love was a kind of interference, he whispered, his gaze fixed on the floor. That being a good son made me a bad husband. She made me ashamed of the best parts of myself, of the parts that came from you and Dad. I stood by and watched her try to erase you from your own life, from my life, because I was too weak to fight for my own family. And that is a failure I will have to live with forever. Tears were now streaming silently down his face. I watched him, my heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. I saw the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard as if they were roses. And I saw the man who had stood silently by while his wife handed me a list of chores at my own Thanksgiving table. The two images warred within me. He had hurt me more deeply than I had ever thought possible, yet he was my son, and his pain was a palpable thing in the quiet room. After a long silence, I finally spoke. I forgive you, Liam. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and desperate hope. But, I continued, my voice firm and clear, forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to the way things were, that life is over. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened. Forgetting is not an option. It means we have a chance, just a chance, to build something new. And this time, it will be built on respect, nothing less. He nodded, seeming to understand the immense gravity of my terms. The conversation shifted then, said from the painful past to the stark, uncertain present. I filed for divorce, he said quietly, Dad. There's no other way. I'm staying at a small hotel in town with the kids for now. Chloe. She went back to her parents' house in Connecticut. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I don't know what I'm going to do. Mom, I've lost everything. Here was the precipice. The old me, the lifelong caretaker, would have rushed in to solve his problems, to offer him a room, to smooth his path. But that Eleanor was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that the truest love sometimes required letting go. No, Liam, I corrected him gently, you haven't lost everything. You have your children, you have your health, and you have the chance to become the man your father always knew you could be, but you must do it on your own. I laid out the new boundaries, not as punishments, but as the necessary framework for our new relationship. This is my home, I stated, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. You and the children are welcome to visit. You can come for dinner on Sundays. The children can spend weekends here when you and I have arranged it beforehand. But you will not be moving back in. You need to find your own place, manage your own finances, and build your own life. I will be your mother, and I will be Sophie and Leo's grandmother. I will not be your safety net. I could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes, the last hope of an easy solution being extinguished. But it was replaced by something else, a dawning understanding, and perhaps a glimmer of respect. He knew I was right. He had to stand on his own 2 feet, not just for himself, but for his children. We talked for another hour about the practicalities, how to tell the children, how to arrange visitation, how to begin the long process of untangling his finances from Chloe's deception. When he finally stood to leave, He paused at the door. He looked around the room, at the warm, comfortable space I had reclaimed, a space that was now truly and completely mine. There was no hug, no easy absolution. There was only a long, searching look between a mother and a son who were, for the first time in more than a decade, seeing each other clearly. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly. And I knew he wasn't just thanking me for the coffee. He left as quietly as he had arrived, his small rental car disappearing into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, the solid wood a comfort against my back. The storm outside had passed, and in its wake, the air felt clean and new. The path forward was uncertain and fraught with difficulty was but for the first time in a very long time, it was a path I was walking on my own terms. 6 months passed. The raw, open wound of that winter confrontation slowly began to scar over, healing into something new and strong. The seasons themselves seemed to mirror our family's difficult transition. The harsh, unforgiving Maine winter, with its howling winds and heavy snows, eventually gave way to the tentative green shoots of spring. The ice in the harbor broke apart, and the days grew longer, warmer, filled with the promise of light. In that time, Liam began to piece his life back together, not with frantic energy, but with the slow, deliberate care of a craftsman rebuilding something precious from its foundations. He had rented a small, sensible house in a neighborhood just 10 minutes away, a place with a little yard for the children and good schools nearby. The divorce was proceeding, an arduous, emotionally taxing process, but he faced it with a quiet determination I'd not seen in him in years. The man who visited me now was not the same one who had collapsed into my sofa in a heap of shame. He was leaner, perhaps. And while the lines of exhaustion were still etched around his eyes, they were now accompanied by a clarity and a sense of purpose. He was becoming his own man again. Our new rhythm settled into a comfortable routine. Liam and the children would spend most weekends with me. Their arrivals were no longer fraught with tension, but filled with the easy, happy chaos of family. Leo, now 8, would burst through the door, his pockets full of interesting rocks or shells. Sophie, on the cusp of 12, was quieter, but she would seek me out in the kitchen, offering to help chop vegetables or simply sitting at the table, content to be in my company. We baked cookies. We worked in the garden, and I began teaching them the same recipes I had once taught their father, weaving a new generation into the tapestry of our family's history. One bright Saturday afternoon in early May, Sophie and I were in the garden together, our hands deep in the rich, dark earth, planting this year's tomato seedlings. She was quiet for a long time, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Then, without looking at me, she asked the question I had known was eventually coming. "Grandma Ellie," she began, her voice small. Is it because of you that Mom and Dad split up?" I stopped my work, my trowel resting in the soil. I turned to look at my granddaughter, at her beautiful, serious face, and my heart ached with a profound tenderness. I saw in her eyes the burden of a child trying to make sense of the seismic shifts in her world. I reached out and gently brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Oh, my sweet girl," I said, my voice soft but clear. "No, absolutely not. What happened between your father and your mother is about them, and only them. It's about the very complicated and difficult mistakes that grown-ups sometimes make." She finally looked up at me, her gaze searching mine for the truth. "But Mom says you were trying to take Dad away from her." I chose my words with the utmost care. Sometimes, when people are hurting, they say things that aren't quite right. Your father and I are rebuilding our relationship, just as you and I are spending this wonderful time together now. But my love for your dad, and especially my love for you and Leo, has never, ever changed. That is the one thing in all of this that is simple and true. You are my granddaughter, and that is forever. She seemed to absorb this. a small, relieved sigh escaping her lips. She leaned over and gave me a quick, fierce hug. In that moment, I wasn't just planting tomatoes, I was tending to the fragile roots of my family's future. My own life, too, had begun to blossom. I had joined a book club at the local library, a group of intelligent, funny women my age who argued passionately about literature and shared stories of their lives over tea. I had started taking long walks along the cliff paths, rediscovering the rugged beauty of the coastline. My home was once again a place of warmth and welcome. Friends I hadn't seen in years began to stop by, drawn back into my orbit now that the chilling presence of Chloe was gone. The house was filled not with tense silence, but with easy laughter and genuine conversation. I was no longer just a caretaker. I was living. The summer arrived in a blaze of glory, bathing the coast in a warm, golden light. It was a perfect afternoon in late July when the final act of my story seemed to write itself. I was in my garden, kneeling on my foam pad, weeding the bed of roses that Arthur and I had planted together so long ago. The blooms were magnificent this year, their deep red and soft pink petals perfuming the salt-tinged air. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a contentment so deep and quiet it felt like a prayer. I heard the sound of their car before I saw it, followed by the slam of doors and the joyous sound of my grandchildren's laughter tumbling through the air. I looked up to see them walking across the lawn towards me, Liam, and the two bright lights of my life. Liam was carrying a bag of groceries, and he was smiling, a real, unburdened smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He looked like my son again. "We come bearing provisions for the queen of the castle," he announced, his voice playful. "And I'm starving," Leo declared, running ahead to throw his arms around my legs. Sophie followed, a shy but genuine smile on her face. "Hi, Grandma. The roses look beautiful." The four of us went inside, into the kitchen that was now indisputably mine. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells. Instead, we fell into an easy, collaborative rhythm preparing dinner. Liam, though still clumsy in the kitchen, willingly chopped vegetables. Sophie tossed a salad with the focused precision of a young chef. And Leo was entrusted with the very important job of setting the table. As I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of simmering tomato sauce, I watched them. I saw my son, patiently showing Leo how to fold the napkins. I saw my granddaughter, confidently adding her own touches to the salad. The room was filled with the warm, ordinary chaos of family life, and my heart felt so full I thought it might burst. It was in that simple, perfect moment that the final piece of my own understanding clicked into place. I thought back to that dreadful Thanksgiving dinner, to the woman who had sat at that table, diminished and humiliated. That woman was gone. The card, with its insulting command, had been meant to be my final dismissal. Instead, it had been my liberation. It had forced me to confront the slow, creeping erasure of my own soul and to finally, fight back. My journey hadn't been about revenge. Revenge is a bitter drink that only harms the one who holds it. It had been about reclamation. It was about standing on the soil of my own life and declaring, "This is mine." I was no longer the servant, waiting for instructions. I was the matriarch, the pillar, the queen in her own castle. A castle built not of stone and mortar, but of love, resilience, and hard-won respect. As we sat down to eat at the beautiful, imperfect table made of reclaimed wood, I looked at the faces of my son and my grandchildren, and I saw not a broken family, but a smaller, stronger, more authentic one that had been forged in the fires of a painful truth. Liam raised his glass of water. "To Mom," he said simply, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "The heart of this home." And in his gaze, I saw not just love, but a deep and abiding respect. It was all I had ever truly wanted. The path forward was still long, but I was no longer afraid. I was home.